He stood at the microphone during his promotion dinner, told 300 people I was just a secretary who fetched his coffee, and suggested I should focus on looking pretty instead of trying to understand his important work. The room erupted in laughter while I sat there in the dress he had chosen, wearing the smile he expected. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that I was the senior consultant his company had hired 6 months ago to evaluate executive performance. And my confidential report, sitting in the CEO's inbox at that very moment, recommended his immediate demotion for incompetence, financial mismanagement, and creating a hostile work environment. 3 days later, when he opened the termination letter and saw my signature at the bottom, his face told me he finally understood. I just smiled the same smile I had worn at that dinner and watched his entire world collapse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Alexandra Hayes, and I have spent the last 14 years building one of the most respected corporate consulting practices on the East Coast. I hold a doctorate in organizational psychology from Columbia University, an MBA from Wharton, and certifications in executive coaching, change management, and corporate restructuring that took me 8 years to complete while working full-time. My firm, Meridian Strategic Consulting, specializes in corporate diagnostics. We are the people companies call when something is fundamentally broken at the leadership level, but they cannot quite identify what or who is causing the dysfunction. Fortune 500 companies pay me between $200,000 and $500,000 per engagement to embed myself in their organizations, observe their leadership in action, interview employees at every level, analyze financial and operational data, and produce comprehensive reports that identify exactly where the problems exist and how to fix them. My reports have led to the termination of 37 senior executives, the restructuring of 12 companies, and the prevention of at least 4 corporate bankruptcies that I can document. I am good at what I do. More than good. I am one of perhaps 15 people in the country who operate at this level of corporate consulting, and my calendar is booked solid 18 months in advance. But the 300 people laughing at Jonathan Pierce's promotion dinner had no idea who I was. To them, I was simply Alexandra Martin, Jonathan's fiancée, the quiet woman who smiled politely at corporate events, who listened attentively when the executives talked, who never interrupted or drew attention to herself. Jonathan had introduced me that way for the past 3 years, ever since we met at a charity gala in Boston where I was networking with potential clients, and he was attending as a mid-level operations manager at Blackwell Industries. Jonathan Pierce. Tall, classically handsome, impeccably dressed, charming in the way that comes naturally to people who have never had to work particularly hard for anything. He came from old money, the kind of generational wealth that provides private school education, Ivy League connections, and entry-level positions at prestigious companies regardless of actual competence. When we met, he was 34 years old and had been working at Blackwell Industries for 6 years, moving through various management positions without making any particular mark, but also without creating obvious problems. He had approached me at that charity gala with practiced confidence, complimenting my dress and asking what I did for work. I had made a split-second decision that I would come to question many times over the following 3 years. Instead of telling him about Meridian Strategic Consulting, about my doctorate and my client list and my professional reputation, I had simply said I worked in business consulting. Something in his expression, a flicker of condescension, had made me hesitate to share more. He had nodded as if that explained everything and began telling me about his important work at Blackwell Industries, about his responsibilities and his advancement trajectory and his certainty that he would be a vice president within 5 years. I should have walked away. I should have recognized the warning signs. But he was charming and attentive in those early months, and I was tired of first dates with men who felt threatened by my success or who asked if I could use my consulting connections to advance their careers. Jonathan did not ask me for professional favors because he did not take my professional life seriously enough to consider that I might have anything to offer. At the time, that had felt almost refreshing. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. The proposal happened at his parents' estate in Connecticut, during a weekend gathering with his extended family. His mother, Catherine Pierce, had spent the entire weekend making pointed comments about my background, my education, and my career in ways that felt like compliments on the surface but carried unmistakable undertones of dismissal. She had asked repeatedly what consulting firm I worked for, and I had deflected each time, saying I ran a small independent practice. The truth was that my firm employed 23 people, maintained offices in Boston and New York, and had gross revenues of $14 million annually, but something about Catherine Pierce's barely concealed snobbery made me reluctant to provide details she would inevitably find some way to diminish. Jonathan proposed with his grandmother's ring, a beautiful Art Deco diamond that had been in the Pierce family for 4 generations. He got down on one knee in front of his parents, his 2 brothers, his sister, and approximately 20 extended family members. Everyone applauded. His mother cried carefully calculated tears that did not disturb her makeup. His father shook my hand with the firm grip of a man accustomed to sealing business deals. I said yes because in that moment, surrounded by his family's enthusiasm and his apparent devotion, I genuinely believed we could build something meaningful together. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of gradually shrinking myself to fit into the shape Jonathan and his family expected. 3 years of attending his company events as arm candy, of listening to him describe his work as if he were orchestrating mergers and acquisitions rather than managing mid-level operations, of smiling politely when his colleagues made jokes about women in business or suggested that my consulting work was probably helping small businesses with their social media strategy. 3 years of telling myself that his dismissiveness did not matter, that I knew my own worth, that I did not need his validation or recognition. 3 years of ignoring increasingly obvious signs that Jonathan Pierce was not the man I thought I was marrying. The promotion dinner happened on a Friday evening in October at the Riverside Grand Hotel in downtown Boston. Blackwell Industries had rented the ballroom for a celebration honoring recent promotions and company achievements. Jonathan had been promoted 6 weeks earlier from Senior Operations Manager to Director of Strategic Operations, a position that came with a substantial salary increase, a larger office, and a seat in executive leadership meetings. He had been ecstatic about the promotion, had celebrated by purchasing a new Porsche and booking a vacation to the Maldives for after our wedding, which was scheduled for the following spring. What Jonathan did not know was that I had been working at Blackwell Industries for the past 6 months. The engagement had begun in April. Richard Blackwell, the 72-year-old CEO and founder of Blackwell Industries, had contacted Meridian Strategic Consulting through a referral from another client. Blackwell Industries was a manufacturing and distribution company that had been family-owned for 45 years, with annual revenues of approximately $300 million and 1,800 employees across 4 states. Richard was preparing to transition leadership to the next generation and wanted an objective assessment of his executive team before making final decisions about succession planning. The engagement was standard for my practice. I would embed myself in the organization under a nondescript title, usually as a special projects coordinator or executive assistant to the CEO, which gave me access to leadership meetings and internal communications without raising suspicion about my true purpose. I would spend 4 to 6 months observing, interviewing, analyzing, and gathering data. Then I would produce a comprehensive report with specific recommendations about leadership effectiveness, organizational structure, and personnel decisions. Richard Blackwell had signed a confidentiality agreement that was ironclad. He would not reveal my identity or purpose to anyone in the organization, including his own family members who worked in the business. My official title was Executive Research Analyst, reporting directly to him, a vague designation that could mean almost anything. I worked from a small office on the executive floor, attended leadership meetings as a silent observer taking notes, and conducted hundreds of interviews with employees at every level of the organization. Jonathan worked in the operations division on the 3rd floor. I worked on the 7th floor. Our paths never crossed professionally because he had no reason to attend executive leadership meetings and I had no reason to visit the operations department during my research phase. He knew I was working on a project for one of my consulting clients. He did not know which client. He had never asked for details because he fundamentally did not believe my work was important or interesting enough to warrant his attention. During those 6 months, I learned things about Jonathan Pierce that I had somehow missed during 3 years of dating and engagement. I learned that he was known throughout the operations division as someone who took credit for his team's work while blaming them for any failures. I learned that he had a pattern of speaking condescendingly to female colleagues and making inappropriate comments about their appearance in ways that stopped just short of actionable harassment. I learned that he regularly inflated performance metrics in his reports to senior leadership presenting projects as more successful than they actually were. I learned that his team had a turnover rate of 43%, more than double the company average, and that exit interviews consistently cited his management style as the primary reason for departure. I learned that the promotion he had received to Director of Strategic Operations had been controversial among the executive team. Several leaders had argued that Jonathan lacked the strategic thinking and people management skills necessary for director-level responsibilities. But he had a powerful advocate in Gerald Pierce, his uncle, who served as chief operating officer and had significant influence over operational appointments. Gerald had argued that Jonathan deserved the opportunity to grow into the role, that his family connections demonstrated loyalty to the company, and that his Ivy League education indicated potential that simply needed the right opportunity to flourish. Richard Blackwell had been skeptical but had ultimately approved the promotion over the objections of his HR director and his head of operations. That decision had been made in March, 1 month before I began my engagement. By the time I started my research in April, Jonathan had already been in his new role for several weeks. What I observed over the following months confirmed every concern the dissenting executives had raised. Jonathan was actively terrible at his job. He made decisions based on what would make him look good rather than what would benefit the company. He ignored input from his team members and then blamed them when initiatives failed. He spent more time managing up, cultivating relationships with senior executives, than managing down, supporting the people who actually did the work. He was charming and confident in meetings with leadership, presenting polished presentations that concealed the dysfunction in his department. But interviews with his direct reports painted a picture of a department in quiet crisis, hemorrhaging talent, missing deadlines, and operating well below its potential. The most damaging information came from the financial analysis. Jonathan's department had a budget of $12 million annually. Over the 18 months he had been in operations management, his department had consistently overspent its budget by margins ranging from 8 to 15%. The overruns were carefully concealed through accounting techniques that spread costs across multiple budget categories, making them difficult to track unless someone was specifically looking for patterns. But I was specifically looking for patterns. That was my job. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I compiled the data, the picture was clear. Jonathan Pierce had cost Blackwell Industries approximately $2 million in unnecessary expenditures, lost productivity due to team turnover, and missed opportunities because of his poor strategic decisions. His promotion to Director of Strategic Operations had made the problem worse rather than better, giving him greater authority to make damaging decisions and broader impact across the organization. My report, delivered to Richard Blackwell in late September, included 12 pages dedicated to Jonathan's performance and a clear recommendation. Jonathan Pierce should be removed from director-level leadership immediately. He lacked the competence, judgment, and interpersonal skills necessary for executive responsibility. The report recommended reassigning him to an individual contributor role, with no management responsibilities, and implementing a performance improvement plan with clear metrics and consequences. If he could not meet those metrics within 90 days, the report recommended termination. Richard had read the report in my presence, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished the section about Jonathan, he had looked up at me with something between anger and exhaustion. "This is Gerald's nephew," he said. "My COO's family. This is going to create significant internal conflict." "I understand," I had replied, "but my job is to tell you the truth about what is happening in your organization, not to manage the political consequences. Jonathan Pierce is costing you money, talent, and operational effectiveness. Every month you leave him in a leadership position is another month of damage to your company." Richard had nodded slowly, closed the report, and said he would review my recommendations carefully before making decisions. That conversation had taken place on September 28th. The promotion dinner was scheduled for October 15th. I had assumed Richard would wait to implement the recommendations until after the dinner, not wanting to create awkwardness at a public celebration. I had been prepared to attend the dinner, smile politely through Jonathan's moment of recognition, and continue maintaining the separation between my professional and personal life for a few more weeks until Richard made his decisions. What I had not been prepared for was Jonathan using the dinner as an opportunity to humiliate me publicly. The evening had started normally enough. We arrived at the Riverside Grand Hotel at 6:30. The ballroom was decorated in Blackwell Industries corporate colors, navy and silver, with round tables arranged around a stage where the presentations would take place. Approximately 300 people filled the room, a mix of executives, managers, and their spouses or partners. I recognized many faces from my 6 months of research, people I had interviewed or observed, though none of them recognized me. My work had been conducted discreetly. My interviews always framed as research for general organizational improvement, rather than individual performance evaluation. Jonathan was in his element, working the room with practice charm, introducing me to colleagues and their wives as my beautiful fiancée Alexandra. I shook hands, smiled, made small talk about wedding planning and asked polite questions about people's work. I was good at this performance. I had been doing it for 3 years. We sat at a table near the front with 5 other couples, all people from Jonathan's professional circle. The conversation flowed easily, lubricated by the open bar and the celebratory atmosphere. People talked about their work, their families, their vacation plans. When someone asked what I did, Jonathan answered before I could speak. Alexandra does some consulting work, he said, his tone carrying the same dismissive note I had heard countless times before. Small business stuff mostly. Nothing too technical. She helps companies with their organizational challenges. The description was not entirely inaccurate, but the tone made it sound trivial, as if I were a life coach for struggling entrepreneurs rather than someone who advised major corporations on multimillion-dollar decisions. I had smiled and nodded, not correcting him, maintaining the persona I had carefully constructed over 3 years. Dinner was served at 7:30. Speeches began at 8. Richard Blackwell spoke first, welcoming everyone and talking about the company's strong performance and bright future. Then Gerald Pierce, the COO and Jonathan's uncle, took the stage to announce the recent promotions. He ran through a list of names and new titles, inviting each person to stand and be recognized. The applause was generous, enthusiastic. Then Gerald called Jonathan to the stage. Jonathan walked up with confident strides, shook his uncle's hand, and accepted a plaque commemorating his promotion. Gerald spoke for several minutes about Jonathan's contributions, his leadership potential, his family's long association with Blackwell Industries. Jonathan stood there looking appropriately humble and grateful. Then Gerald handed him the microphone for remarks. This was not unusual. Promoted executives were typically given a few minutes to thank their teams and express appreciation. Jonathan had not mentioned planning remarks, but I had not thought much of it. He was comfortable speaking publicly. He would probably thank his team, acknowledge his uncle, and sit down. Instead, he began talking about the challenges of balancing professional ambition with personal relationships. When you are pursuing excellence in your career, Jonathan said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom sound system, you need a partner who understands the demands and supports your goals. Someone who recognizes that your work requires focus and dedication. Someone who does not compete for attention or try to make everything about themselves. I felt the first flutter of unease. The comment felt pointed, though I could not quite identify why. Jonathan continued, I am fortunate to have found that kind of partner. My fiancée Alexandra is here tonight, and I want to acknowledge her support. She knows her role. She is not trying to impress anyone with her career, or pretend to understand the complexities of what we do here at Blackwell. She is content to focus on the things that actually matter in a relationship. Looking beautiful, creating a welcoming home, supporting my success instead of seeking her own spotlight. The room laughed. It was not malicious laughter, but it was knowing, the kind of laughter that comes from recognition of a shared cultural assumption about gender roles and partnership dynamics. I sat frozen in my chair, my face maintaining the smile that had been locked in place, while something cold and sharp twisted in my chest. Jonathan was not finished. In fact, just last week, Alexandra asked if she could help me prepare for a strategic planning presentation. She said she had some experience with organizational analysis. I had to gently explain that what I do at the director level is probably a bit beyond her expertise. She means well, but there is a difference between helping small businesses figure out their filing systems and actually driving strategic operations for a $300 million company. I told her the best way she could support me was to make sure my suits were pressed and my coffee was ready in the morning. The laughter was louder this time, more pointed. I heard someone at our table whisper, "That is hilarious. She probably thinks she understands his work." I sat there still smiling while my mind processed what had just happened. Jonathan had not simply dismissed my intelligence or competence in private, something he had done countless times during our relationship. He had publicly, in front of 300 people including many of the most powerful business leaders in Boston, reduced me to a decorative accessory whose primary value was aesthetic and domestic. He had made me an object of amusement, a punchline, a cautionary tale about women who overestimated their understanding of important business matters. And he had done it while standing in front of Richard Blackwell, the CEO who had my report sitting in his inbox, the report that laid out in exhaustive detail exactly how incompetent Jonathan Pierce actually was at the work he was mocking me for not understanding. The irony was so perfect it was almost beautiful. Jonathan finished his remarks with thanks to his team and his uncle, then returned to our table amid applause and congratulatory handshakes. He sat down next to me, put his hand on my knee under the table and leaned close. "You are not upset, are you?" he whispered. "It was all in good fun. Everyone knows I adore you." I turned to look at him directly, this man I had agreed to marry, this man who had just humiliated me for entertainment, and I smiled the same smile I had been wearing all evening. "Of course not," I said softly. "It was very funny." He squeezed my knee, satisfied, and turned to accept congratulations from the person on his other side. I sat there for the remainder of the evening, maintaining perfect composure, laughing at appropriate moments, engaging in small talk, playing the role Jonathan had assigned me. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. A decision had crystallized with absolute clarity. I had spent 3 years accommodating Jonathan's ego, minimizing myself to make him comfortable, allowing him to believe a fiction about who I was and what I was capable of. I had told myself it did not matter, that I knew my own worth regardless of his recognition. But watching him use me as a prop in his self-aggrandizing performance, seeing the laughter and knowing looks from his colleagues who now viewed me as exactly the shallow, decorative nothing he had painted me to be, I understood that I had been complicit in my own diminishment. I had allowed this. I had enabled it. I had chosen to hide my light to avoid threatening his ego, and he had responded by using my manufactured smallness to elevate himself. That ended tonight. When the dinner concluded at 10:30, Jonathan and I walked to the parking garage together. He was buoyant, energized by the evening's success and the recognition from his colleagues. He talked enthusiastically about the new responsibilities of his role, about the projects he would oversee, about his certainty that he was on track to become a vice president within 2 years. I listened, saying very little, my mind working through logistics and timelines. When we reached my car, Jonathan kissed me goodnight. "I will call you tomorrow," he said. "Maybe we can look at honeymoon destinations. I am thinking we should upgrade to one of those overwater bungalows in the Maldives. We can afford it now with my new salary." "That sounds wonderful," I said. He smiled, kissed me again, and walked to his own car. I sat in my vehicle for 10 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly and deliberately. Then I drove home to my condominium in Cambridge, poured a glass of wine, and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and composed an email to Richard Blackwell. The subject line read, "Implementation timeline for report recommendations." The body of the email was brief and professional. "Richard, I have completed my analysis and submitted my comprehensive report as scheduled. Given recent observations of organizational dynamics, I recommend implementing the personnel recommendations in my report within the next 7 to 10 business days, rather than waiting for the originally discussed timeline of 30 days. The situations I identified are actively creating damage that will compound with delay. I am available to discuss implementation strategy at your convenience. My contract includes support through the transition period, and I am prepared to assist with communications, restructuring logistics, or any other elements you require. Please let me know how you would like to proceed." I attached a supplementary document to the email. It was a detailed account of Jonathan's remarks at the promotion dinner, including direct quotes that I had memorized verbatim, contextualized within the pattern of behavior I had documented in my original report. The document noted that Jonathan's public denigration of his fiancée's professional competence, delivered to an audience of 300 people including subordinates and colleagues, represented exactly the kind of judgment failure and interpersonal dysfunction that made him unsuitable for leadership responsibility. I sent the email at 11:47 on Friday night. Richard Blackwell responded at 6:15 Saturday morning. His email contained 3 sentences. Your recommendation is noted and accepted. I will begin implementation on Monday morning. Please be available Monday afternoon for consultation regarding transition logistics. I read the email 3 times, then closed my laptop and went to bed. When I woke on Saturday morning, I had 12 text messages from Jonathan, pictures from the dinner, including several of me sitting at our table smiling, a message about brunch plans, a link to the Maldives resort he wanted to book, a comment about how proud he was to have me by his side. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I went for a long run along the Charles River, pushing myself harder than usual, feeling my body process the anger and hurt and determination that had been building for 3 years and had crystallized last night into something sharp and purposeful. When I returned home, I replied to Jonathan's messages with brief, pleasant responses. Yes, I had enjoyed the dinner. The photos were lovely. Brunch sounded nice. We could look at the resort together. I met him for brunch at a cafe in Beacon Hill. He was still riding the high from the previous evening, talking expansively about his plans and his future and our future. I listened, asked questions, played the supportive fiancé role one last time. I have been thinking, Jonathan said over his eggs Benedict. After we get married, you should probably scale back your consulting work. I am going to be incredibly busy with my new responsibilities, and I will need you available for company events and entertaining clients. Maybe you could do some volunteer work instead. Use your organizational skills for charity boards or something. It would look good for my professional image to have a wife who is involved in the community rather than trying to compete in business. I took a sip of my coffee, set it down carefully and smiled. That is an interesting idea. Let me think about it. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I know it is a lot to ask, but I really think we need to be strategic about how we present ourselves as a couple. My career trajectory is really taking off, and I need a partner who enhances that rather than complicating it. I understand, I said. And I did. I understood exactly who Jonathan Pierce was and what he believed I was worth. We finished brunch. He kissed me goodbye and said he would call me later. He had plans to play golf with colleagues that afternoon, networking that he described as essential for his continued advancement. I drove home and spent the rest of the weekend preparing, not for confrontation but for transition. I had decisions to make about my own future, separate from whatever was about to happen to Jonathan. Our relationship was ending. That was certain now. The only question was how and when. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Boston. I dressed carefully in a charcoal suit and navy blouse, professional armor for what I knew would be a significant day. I arrived at Blackwell Industries at 8:30 and went directly to Richard Blackwell's office on the 7th floor. His assistant showed me in immediately. Richard stood as I entered, gestured to the conference table by the window rather than the formal seating area. This was a working meeting. Thank you for coming in, he said. I read your supplementary documentation from Friday night. I also had a long conversation with our general counsel and our head of HR over the weekend. We are moving forward with immediate implementation of your personnel recommendations. He slid a document across the table. It was a termination letter addressed to Jonathan Pierce, outlining the reasons for dismissal including performance failures, financial mismanagement, and violations of company policies regarding professional conduct. The letter cited specific examples from my report. The effective date was today, Monday, October 18th. The letter required Jonathan to return all company property, revoked his access to systems and facilities, and outlined the terms of his separation agreement. At the bottom of the letter, in the section labeled Prepared by, was a signature line with my name, Dr. Alexandra Hayes, Principal Consultant, Meridian Strategic Consulting. I want you to deliver this personally, Richard said. Given your relationship with Mr. Pierce, I recognize this places you in a difficult position. If you prefer, I can have HR handle the termination and you can simply provide consultation from a distance. But I think there is value in him understanding exactly who evaluated his performance and exactly why this decision was made. I looked at the letter, at my name printed clearly at the bottom, and felt something settle into place. I will deliver it, I said. What time? He has been called to a meeting in my office at 10 this morning. He believes it is a strategic planning session for his department. You will join us. I will explain that you are the consultant who conducted the organizational review. Then you will present the findings relevant to his termination. Then I will deliver the letter and security will escort him from the building. I nodded. Understood. Richard studied me for a moment. I apologize that this process has put you in this situation. When I hired your firm, I had no idea one of my executives was your fiancé. You maintained your professional boundaries impeccably, and your analysis was thorough and objective. But I recognize this cannot be easy personally. The relationship is over, I said simply. It has been over. I just did not admit it to myself until Friday night. This simply makes the ending official. At 9:55, I walked to Richard's office and took my seat at the conference table. I laid out my report, opened my laptop, and prepared the presentation I had created over the weekend. Specific examples of Jonathan's failures. Financial data documenting his mismanagement. Interview quotes from his team members describing his leadership style. Performance metrics comparing his department to others. Recommendations for restructuring operations after his departure. At precisely 10 o'clock, Jonathan arrived. He walked into Richard's office with confident strides, dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a leather portfolio. He saw Richard and smiled. Then he saw me sitting at the conference table with my laptop and documents spread in front of me, and his expression shifted to confusion. Alexandra? What are you doing here? Please sit down, Jonathan, Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from me. Jonathan sat slowly, his eyes moving between Richard and me, trying to understand the situation. Is everything okay? I thought this was a strategic planning meeting. This is a termination meeting, Richard said. His voice was calm, neutral, businesslike. Dr. Hayes has been conducting an organizational review of Blackwell Industries' leadership for the past 6 months. Her findings regarding your performance have led to the decision to end your employment with this company. Jonathan stared at Richard, then at me, then back at Richard. I do not understand. Alexandra is not Dr. Hayes. She is my fiancée. She does small business consulting. I spoke for the first time, my voice professional and clear. My name is Dr. Alexandra Hayes. I hold a doctorate in organizational psychology from Columbia University and an MBA from Wharton. I am the founder and principal consultant of Meridian Strategic Consulting, which specializes in executive performance evaluation and corporate restructuring. I have been working under contract with Blackwell Industries since April to assess leadership effectiveness across the organization. You are one of 12 executives whose performance I evaluated in depth. Jonathan's face had gone pale. You have been working here? For 6 months? Yes. The confidentiality agreement with Mr. Blackwell prevented me from disclosing my engagement or my purpose. My evaluation of your performance was conducted according to standard professional protocols, including interviews with your direct reports, analysis of financial and operational data, and direct observation of your leadership in various contexts. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him, displaying the executive summary of my findings. Over the 18 months you have held management positions in operations, your department has experienced turnover of 43%, budget overruns averaging 12% annually, and declining performance metrics across all key indicators. Your team members describe your leadership style as credit-claiming, blame-deflecting, and demeaning, particularly toward female colleagues. Your financial management has cost this company approximately $2 million in unnecessary expenditures and lost productivity. Jonathan was shaking his head slowly, his expression cycling between disbelief and dawning horror. This is insane. You cannot evaluate me. You are my fiancé. This is a conflict of interest. I disclosed the relationship to Mr. Blackwell immediately upon recognizing it during my preliminary research, I said. We discuss whether my engagement should continue. Mr. Blackwell determined that my professional reputation and methodology warranted proceeding with the evaluation, with additional oversight and verification of findings. An independent third party reviewed my report and confirmed its accuracy and objectivity. I advanced to the next slide, showing the timeline of my observations. My recommendation to Mr. Blackwell was that you should be removed from director-level responsibilities immediately and either transition to an individual contributor role, with intensive performance management, or terminated, depending on the organization's appetite for investing in your rehabilitation. Richard spoke again. I have made the decision to terminate your employment rather than pursue remediation. Your pattern of behavior is too extensive and your judgment failures too significant to warrant the investment. He slid the termination letter across the table. Jonathan picked it up with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the document. When he reached the bottom and saw my name, his face flushed red. "You did this," he said, looking at me. His voice was rising. "You orchestrated this. This is because I did not take your work seriously. This is revenge." "This is professional evaluation," I said calmly. "My findings are based on objective data, documented patterns, and verifiable facts. Your performance as a manager and director has been consistently substandard. You have cost this company money, talent, and operational effectiveness. That is not revenge. That is reality." Jonathan stood abruptly. "I will sue you. I will sue this company. You cannot do this. My uncle is the COO. He will never allow this." "Your uncle was presented with the findings yesterday," Richard said. "He acknowledged that the data supported the decision. He is not contesting the termination." That stopped Jonathan cold. He stood there, the termination letter crumpled in his hand, his face working through emotions too fast to track. Then he turned to me. "Friday night," he said slowly, "when I gave that speech, you already knew. You already knew you were going to do this." "I delivered my report to Mr. Blackwell on September 28th, I said. 3 weeks before your promotion dinner. The timing of implementation was his decision. I recommended accelerating the timeline after observing your judgment at that event." Jonathan's expression twisted. "I made a joke about your work. That is why you are destroying my career. Because your ego could not handle some teasing?" I stood, gathering my materials, closing my laptop. "You did not joke about my work, Jonathan. You publicly humiliated me. You reduced me to a decorative accessory whose only value was making you look good. You did it in front of 300 people, including many of your colleagues and subordinates. And you did it while standing in a building where I had spent 6 months documenting your professional incompetence." I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. Then I stopped and turned back. For 3 years, I made myself smaller to avoid threatening your ego. I hid my education, my accomplishments, my professional reputation because you needed to believe you were the successful one in our relationship. I enabled your delusion that you were brilliant and I was decorative. That was my mistake. I own it. I met his eyes directly. But when you used that dynamic to humiliate me publicly, to make me an object of ridicule and contempt in front of your professional community, you revealed something I had been trying not to see for 3 years. You do not love me, Jonathan. You never did. You love the reflection of yourself that you see when you are with someone you perceive as lesser. You need to feel superior. And I will never again make myself small enough to give someone that satisfaction. I turned to Richard. I will be available this week to consult on operational restructuring in the wake of personnel changes. My assistant will coordinate scheduling. Then I walked out of the office, leaving Jonathan Pierce standing in the wreckage of the career he thought he had built and the relationship he thought he controlled. Security escorted him from the building 20 minutes later. I watched from my temporary office window as he walked across the parking lot carrying a box with his personal belongings, his shoulders hunched, his confident stride replaced by the shuffling steps of someone in shock. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my assistant. "Richard Blackwell's office just called. 3 executives he fired based on your report have already reached out asking if you are accepting new clients. Also, Margaret Chun from Atlas Corporation saw your name on a document that circulated internally at Blackwell and wants to schedule a consultation. Your calendar is filling up." I looked down at the parking lot one more time. Jonathan had reached his Porsche, the one he had purchased to celebrate his promotion. He stood beside it for a long moment before getting in and driving away. I turned away from the window, opened my laptop, and began preparing for my next client meeting. The empire I had built was intact. The reputation I had earned was secure. And the relationship that had been slowly suffocating me for 3 years was finally completely over. I was free. The silence in my temporary office at Blackwell Industries felt different after Jonathan left the building. It was not the absence of sound but rather the presence of something new. Space. Clarity. The atmospheric shift that occurs when a pressure system finally breaks, and the air can move freely again. I sat at my desk reviewing the implementation timeline Richard Blackwell, and I had established for the remaining personnel recommendations in my report. Jonathan had been the most urgent termination, but he was not the only one. 2 other executives required immediate removal due to performance failures and ethical violations. 4 more needed formal performance improvement plans with clear metrics and consequences. The restructuring would take approximately 6 weeks to complete fully, and my contract included support through the entire transition period. My phone vibrated continuously on the desk beside my laptop. Text messages arriving in rapid succession. I glanced at the screen and saw Jonathan's name appearing repeatedly. I turned the phone face down and continued working. Whatever he wanted to say could wait. I had professional obligations to fulfill, and his emotional crisis was no longer my responsibility to manage. At 11:30, my assistant Caroline called from our Boston office. Her voice carried a mixture of excitement and concern that I had learned to recognize over the 8 years she had worked with me. "Alexandra, your phone has been ringing constantly for the past hour. Jonathan Pierce has called the office 12 times. He is demanding to speak with you. He sounds extremely agitated. Should I continue deflecting? Or do you want me to do something more formal?" "Send him a message through his personal email," I said. "Inform him that all communication regarding his termination should be directed to Blackwell Industries Human Resources Department and Legal Counsel. Any communication regarding our personal relationship should wait until I have had time to process recent events. Tell him I will reach out when I am ready to discuss our engagement, but that attempting to contact me repeatedly through professional channels is inappropriate and needs to stop immediately." "Understood," Caroline said. "Also, you have 3 new client inquiries that came in this morning. All 3 specifically mention your work at Blackwell Industries. Word is spreading quickly. Margaret Chun from Atlas Corporation wants to schedule a consultation this week if possible. She said their board has concerns about their executive team, and they want the same level of analysis you provided to Blackwell." I felt something loosen in my chest. This was what I had built over 14 years. A reputation solid enough that even a situation as personally complicated as the Jonathan termination could not damage it. In fact, the situation appeared to be enhancing my credibility. Other organizations were recognizing that if I could maintain professional objectivity even when evaluating someone I was personally involved with, my assessments must be genuinely reliable and uncompromising. "Schedule Margaret for Thursday afternoon," I said. "Send her the standard consultation package and engagement agreement. And Caroline, thank you for handling Jonathan's calls. I know that is not in your job description. Actually, I think it falls under the category of protecting you from distractions so you can do your best work," Caroline said. "Which is absolutely in my job description. Take care of yourself, Alexandra. This must be incredibly difficult personally, even if it was professionally necessary." After we hung up, I sat for a moment appreciating Caroline's steady competence. She had been with Meridian Strategic Consulting since nearly the beginning, had watched the firm grow from a solo practice to a team of 23 professionals, and had developed an almost preternatural ability to anticipate what I needed before I articulated it. Good people were rare. Loyalty combined with competence was even rarer. I made a mental note to increase her year-end bonus substantially. At noon, Richard Blackwell knocked on my office door and entered with his head of human resources, Patricia Moreno. Patricia was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair, and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent 30 years managing organizational crises without losing her composure. "We wanted to update you on the immediate reactions to this morning's termination," Richard said, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. Patricia sat beside him, tablet in hand with what I assumed were detailed notes about employee responses and legal considerations. Jonathan contacted his uncle Gerald immediately after leaving the building, Patricia began. Gerald requested a meeting with Richard to discuss the decision. That meeting occurred an hour ago. Gerald expressed concern about the family implications and asked whether reconsideration was possible. Richard explained that the decision was final and based on extensive documented evidence of performance failures and policy violations. Gerald ultimately acknowledged that he had been aware of some performance issues but had hoped Jonathan would improve with more responsibility and mentoring. In other words, Richard added, Gerald knew his nephew was struggling but used his influence to secure a promotion anyway, hoping it would somehow solve the problem. That decision cost me 6 months of additional damage to the operations department and nearly cost me several good employees who were preparing to leave because of Jonathan's management. I nodded. That pattern is not uncommon. Family loyalty often overrides objective assessment, especially when the family member in question is skilled at managing up while failing to manage down. Gerald saw Jonathan's charm and confidence in executive meetings and assumed that represented his overall competence. He did not see what Jonathan's direct reports experienced daily. We are implementing additional safeguards, Patricia said. Going forward, any promotion to director level or above will require input from direct reports through a formal 360 evaluation process. We cannot prevent family members from advocating for each other, but we can ensure that advocacy is balanced against objective performance data and feedback from multiple sources. This was exactly the kind of systemic improvement that made organizational consulting worthwhile. Individual terminations addressed immediate problems, but structural changes prevented those problems from recurring. I felt a familiar satisfaction that came from knowing my work would have lasting positive impact beyond the current crisis. Have there been other reactions from the executive team or from Jonathan's department? I asked. Patricia smiled slightly. Jonathan's direct reports are quietly jubilant. 3 of them separately contacted HR this morning to express relief and to ask whether this means the department will be getting new leadership. The operations team has been demoralized for months, and this decision appears to have restored their faith that leadership is actually paying attention to their concerns. Several executives have privately expressed support for the decision, Richard added, including 2 who had objected to Jonathan's promotion originally but were overruled. There is a sense that accountability is being taken seriously and that performance actually matters more than connections. That is precisely the message I wanted to send by acting on your recommendations quickly and decisively. We spent the next 45 minutes reviewing the implementation plan for the remaining personnel actions. 2 terminations would occur tomorrow. 4 performance improvement plans would be initiated by the end of the week. We discussed communication strategy, legal considerations, and operational continuity plans to ensure the transitions did not disrupt client service or employee morale beyond what was necessary and appropriate. As Richard and Patricia prepared to leave, Richard paused at the door. I want to acknowledge again that this situation placed you in an extraordinarily difficult position. You conducted yourself with complete professionalism throughout, but I recognize the personal cost. If you need time or support, please do not hesitate to ask. I appreciate that, I said. But honestly, the personal relationship was already over. I just had not admitted it to myself. Friday night made that admission unavoidable. What happened this morning was simply the formal ending of something that had been dying slowly for quite some time. After they left, I allowed myself to sit quietly for several minutes, feeling the weight of the morning settle into my body. I had terminated my fiancé's employment. I had watched him escorted from the building by security. I had ended our relationship in the most public and definitive way possible, and I felt not guilt or regret but rather an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with anger at myself for waiting so long to acknowledge what had been obvious. I had compromised myself for 3 years. I had hidden essential parts of my identity to make Jonathan comfortable. I had allowed him to diminish me publicly and privately because confronting his behavior would have required confronting the fundamental incompatibility of our values and expectations. I had chosen temporary peace over authentic partnership, and the cost had been a steady erosion of my self-respect. That ended now. Permanently. My phone buzzed again. This time it was not Jonathan but rather my closest friend, Dr. Rachel Kim, who taught organizational psychology at MIT, and had been my confidant through every major decision of my professional life. Her text message was characteristically direct. Heard through the academic grapevine that something significant happened with your Blackwell engagement. Are you okay? Do you need company, wine, or both? I smiled despite myself and replied immediately. Both. My place tonight. 7 o'clock. Long story that requires in-person telling. Rachel responded within seconds. I will bring excellent wine and Thai food. See you at 7. I spent the rest of the afternoon completing administrative work related to the Blackwell engagement and responding to the new client inquiries Caroline had mentioned. By 4 o'clock, I had scheduled 2 consultations for later in the week and had preliminary conversations with a third potential client whose situation sounded complex and challenging in exactly the way I found most professionally satisfying. At 4:30, I gathered my materials, locked my temporary office, and drove back to my condominium in Cambridge. The drive along the Charles River felt different somehow. The October afternoon light was golden and clear, and I found myself noticing details I normally overlooked. The way the light reflected off the water, the joggers and cyclists following the riverside paths, the gradual transition from the dense urban environment of downtown Boston to the more residential character of Cambridge. I was paying attention because I was not mentally rehearsing conversations with Jonathan or planning how to manage his moods or calculating whether a particular comment would trigger his defensiveness. For the first time in 3 years, my mental space was entirely my own. The relief was so profound it felt almost physical, like taking off shoes that had been too tight for so long I had forgotten what comfortable felt like. My condominium was a 2-bedroom unit on the 6th floor of a converted industrial building, overlooking the river. I had purchased it 8 years ago when Meridian Strategic Consulting's revenue reached the point where I could afford to invest in real estate. The space was modern and minimalist, decorated with clean lines and neutral colors that created a sense of calm. Jonathan had always complained that it felt too sterile, too much like a hotel, not warm enough for a real home. He had been pushing for us to purchase a house together in one of the affluent suburbs, something with traditional architecture and space for the family he assumed we would eventually have. I had resisted that conversation repeatedly, always with vague excuses about timing and market conditions. Now I understood that some part of me had known all along that this relationship would not last. I had been protecting my assets and my independence, even while pretending to be fully committed to a shared future. I changed into comfortable clothes, poured a glass of water, and sat on my balcony watching the river traffic below. Sailboats were taking advantage of the unseasonably warm October weather, their white sails bright against the darkening water. I watched them tack and turn, responding to wind patterns I could not see but they clearly understood. That was what I needed to do now. Respond to patterns I had been ignoring. Adjust course based on reality rather than wishful thinking. Stop pretending that a relationship could work simply because I wanted it to work or because ending it would be uncomfortable. At exactly 7 o'clock, my doorbell rang. Rachel stood in the hallway holding 2 bags of Thai food and a bottle of wine that I recognized as expensive and excellent. She took one look at my face and stepped inside, set down the bags and pulled me into a tight hug. "Tell me everything," she said. We sat at my kitchen island with food spread between us, and I told her the entire story. The 6-month consulting engagement at Blackwell Industries. The discovery that my fiancé worked there. The decision to proceed with the evaluation while maintaining strict professional boundaries. The months of research revealing Jonathan's incompetence and ethical failures. The promotion dinner where he humiliated me publicly. The termination meeting this morning where I revealed my true identity and role. Rachel listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to anger to something that looked like pride. When I finished, she refilled both our wine glasses and raised hers in a toast. "To professional integrity and personal liberation," she said. "You did the right thing. Both professionally and personally. Jonathan is a mediocre man who needed you to be smaller so he could feel bigger. You are well rid of him." "I wasted 3 years," I said quietly. 3 years of hiding who I am and what I am capable of. 3 years of making myself less to accommodate his ego. How did I let that happen? Rachel set down her wine glass and looked at me directly. You let it happen because you are human and because the conditioning runs deep. We are taught from childhood that successful women threaten male egos, and that maintaining relationships requires making ourselves palatable to men who feel competitive with us. You are brilliant, successful, and accomplished. Those qualities intimidate a lot of men. Jonathan seemed like he was not intimidated because he genuinely did not understand how accomplished you are. You made the mistake of thinking his ignorance was the same as security. I should have told him the truth from the beginning, I said. About my education, my firm, my professional reputation. If I had been honest from the start, maybe he would have ended things himself and saved us both 3 years. Or maybe he would have stayed because dating a successful consultant was good for his image, Rachel countered. But he would have spent those 3 years undermining you, making jokes about your work, finding subtle ways to diminish your accomplishments so he could maintain his sense of superiority. You cannot win with men like Jonathan. Either you hide who you are and lose yourself, or you show who you are and they work to cut you down. The problem is not your choices. The problem is men who need women to be less than them. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then Rachel asked the question I had been avoiding thinking about. What happens now with the wedding? You had a venue booked, invitations designed, deposits paid. Are you going to formally end the engagement or just let it fade? I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the Photos app, and found the picture of the engagement ring Jonathan had given me 3 years ago. His grandmother's Art Deco diamond, a family heirloom that his mother had presented with great ceremony and barely concealed reluctance, as if she were bestowing a precious treasure on someone who did not quite deserve it. I am going to return the ring to his mother this week, I said, along with a formal letter ending the engagement. I am going to cancel the venue and inform the guests that the wedding will not be taking place. I am going to do all of it quickly and definitively, so there is no ambiguity and no opportunity for Jonathan to try to negotiate or convince me to reconsider. Good, Rachel said firmly. Clean breaks heal faster than prolonged uncertainty. And honestly, Alexandra, you deserve someone who celebrates your success rather than feeling threatened by it. Someone who wants you at full brightness, not dimmed down to make him comfortable. Right now I deserve to focus on myself and my work, I said. I am not interested in another relationship. I want to remember who I am when I am not constantly managing someone else's insecurity. Rachel raised her glass again. To rediscovering yourself. And to making mediocre men face consequences for their mediocrity. We spent the rest of the evening talking about everything except Jonathan. Rachel told me about her research on leadership development and organizational culture. We discussed potential collaborations between my consulting practice and her academic work. We laughed about departmental politics at MIT and client absurdities in my practice. We talked like we had always talked before Jonathan, when my conversation was not constantly filtered through concern about whether I was spending too much time with friends or focusing too much on work. Rachel left at midnight with promises to check in daily and demands that I call immediately if I needed support or distraction. After she left, I stood on my balcony again, looking out at the city lights and the dark river, and felt something I had not felt in 3 years. Peace. The next morning arrived with messages from Jonathan that I deleted without reading. Caroline had sent him the formal communication about appropriate channels for contact, but he was apparently ignoring it. I made a note to have my attorney send a more official cease and desist letter if the contact continued. I spent Tuesday morning at Blackwell Industries overseeing the next 2 terminations. Both were handled professionally and without drama. The executives in question had been expecting consequences based on their awareness of performance issues, and both accepted their terminations with resignation, rather than shock or outrage. Tuesday afternoon, I met with Margaret Chun from Atlas Corporation. Atlas was a mid-sized technology company experiencing rapid growth and corresponding growing pains in their leadership structure. Margaret, the founder and CEO, was a woman in her early 40s who had built the company from a startup to a $60 million enterprise in 7 years. She was sharp, direct, and clearly accustomed to making difficult decisions. I heard about your work at Blackwell Industries from Richard Blackwell's wife, Margaret said as we settled into her office conference room. She mentioned that you evaluated their entire executive team and made recommendations that were difficult but necessary. She said you maintained complete objectivity even when it involved someone you were personally connected to. That level of integrity is exactly what I need. I walked Margaret through my typical engagement process, the methodologies I used, the timeline for comprehensive evaluation, and the deliverables she could expect. We discussed pricing, confidentiality agreements, and the logistics of embedding myself in her organization without raising suspicion about my true purpose. I have 6 executives who report directly to me, Margaret said. I trust 4 of them completely. The other 2 concern me, but I cannot articulate exactly why. I need someone who can observe them objectively and tell me whether my instincts are correct or whether I am being paranoid. Instincts are usually correct, I said. But they need to be validated with data. That is what I do. I give you the evidence to either act on your concerns or dismiss them with confidence. We shook hands on a preliminary agreement. Caroline would send the formal contracts later that day. The Atlas engagement would begin in January, giving me time to complete the Blackwell transition and take a much-needed break during the holidays. As I drove back to Cambridge that evening, my phone rang. Not Jonathan this time, but his mother, Catherine Pierce. I considered not answering, but avoiding the conversation would only delay the inevitable. I pulled over into a parking lot and accepted the call. Alexandra. Catherine's voice was cold and clipped. I assume you know why I am calling. I assume it is about Jonathan's termination and the end of our engagement, I said calmly. What you did was unconscionable, Catherine said. You used your position to destroy my son's career because of some personal grievance. You betrayed his trust and our family's trust. We welcomed you into our family, and this is how you repay that acceptance. I felt anger rise sharp and hot, but I kept my voice level. Catherine, I did not destroy Jonathan's career. Jonathan destroyed his own career through consistent poor performance, financial mismanagement, and unprofessional conduct. I documented his failures according to standard professional methodology. The decision to terminate his employment was made by Blackwell Industries CEO, based on objective evidence and consultation with legal counsel and human resources. I was hired to evaluate executive performance months before I knew Jonathan worked there. When I discovered the connection, I disclosed it immediately and proceeded with appropriate oversight and verification. You should have recused yourself, Catherine shot back. You had a conflict of interest. I offered to recuse myself, I said. Richard Blackwell determined that my professional reputation and methodology warranted continuing the engagement with additional safeguards. An independent consultant reviewed my findings and confirmed their accuracy. But honestly, Catherine, this conversation is not about professional ethics. This is about you being unwilling to accept that your son is not as competent as you believe him to be. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. How dare you? Jonathan is brilliant. He graduated from Princeton. He comes from a distinguished family. He had a promising future until you sabotaged him. Jonathan has a degree from Princeton that his family's donations helped secure, I said, no longer bothering to soften my words. He has a family name that opened doors his abilities could not. And he had a position at Blackwell Industries that he was systematically failing at while costing the company millions of dollars in lost productivity and employee turnover. Those are facts. Documented, verified facts. Your inability to accept them does not change their reality. We will be discussing this with our attorneys, Catherine said. Jonathan may have legal recourse. He is welcome to pursue legal action, I said. Discovery will be illuminating. My report is thoroughly documented and supported by extensive evidence. If Jonathan wants that evidence presented in court, including recordings of his inappropriate comments to female colleagues and financial records showing his mismanagement, I am confident my work will withstand scrutiny. I paused, then continued with the words I had been holding back. I am also returning your family ring this week. I will have it delivered to your home by insured courier. The engagement is over. Please do not contact me again except through attorneys if Jonathan chooses to pursue legal action. I ended the call before Catherine could respond, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. That conversation had been necessary but unpleasant. I had spent 3 years trying to earn Catherine Pierce's approval, trying to prove I was worthy of her son despite my lack of family pedigree, and her barely concealed disapproval of my career. Now I understood that her approval had never been available, because I would never be what she wanted for Jonathan. Someone decorative and deferential who would enhance his status without threatening his ego. I was done trying to be that person. I had never been that person. And any relationship that required me to pretend otherwise was not worth having. When I arrived home that evening, I took the engagement ring from my jewelry box, placed it in its original presentation case, and packaged it carefully for courier delivery. I drafted a brief note to accompany it. Catherine, I am returning the Pierce family ring. Thank you for allowing me to wear it for 3 years. I wish Jonathan well in his future endeavors. The engagement is ended by mutual recognition that we are not compatible partners. Please respect my request for no further direct contact. Alexandra. The note was formal, polite, and absolutely final. I scheduled the courier pickup for the following morning. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. No anxiety about Jonathan's mood or needs. No mental rehearsal of how to discuss difficult topics without triggering his defensiveness. No calculation of how to balance my professional obligations with his expectations of my time and attention. Just sleep. Deep, uninterrupted, restorative sleep. Wednesday morning brought news that one of the executives I had recommended for termination at Blackwell Industries had resigned rather than go through the formal termination process. Richard called to inform me that the resignation had been accepted immediately, and that the executive had signed a separation agreement that included confidentiality provisions and a release of claims. One less potential legal complication. I spent Wednesday afternoon meeting with the 4 executives at Blackwell Industries who were being placed on performance improvement plans. These conversations were more delicate than terminations because the goal was rehabilitation rather than removal. Each person needed to understand specifically what was not working in their performance, what standards they needed to meet, and what timeline and support they would receive to make necessary improvements. 3 of the 4 received the feedback professionally and appeared genuinely motivated to improve. The 4th was defensive and combative, insisting that the concerns were exaggerated or unfair. I made a note in my file that this individual would likely not succeed in the improvement plan, and that Blackwell should prepare for eventual termination. Some people could hear difficult feedback and use it for growth. Others could only hear it as attack and responded with blame and justification. By Thursday morning, the immediate crisis phase at Blackwell Industries had concluded. The terminations and resignations were complete. The performance improvement plans were initiated. The departmental restructuring was underway. My role was shifting from active intervention to advisory support, as the organization adjusted to the changes and implemented the systemic improvements Patricia and Richard had designed. I had accomplished what I had been hired to do. I had identified the problems, documented them thoroughly, made clear recommendations, and supported the implementation of necessary changes. The organization was stronger as a result. Employees who had been suffering under poor leadership were relieved. People who had been performing well were validated. Standards of accountability had been established and enforced. This was why I did this work. Not for the satisfaction of terminating incompetent executives, though that could occasionally feel satisfying when the incompetence was severe, but for the positive impact on organizations and the people within them, for the transformation that occurred when dysfunction was removed and excellence was supported, for the restoration of trust that happened when leadership demonstrated that performance mattered more than politics or connections. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. Jonathan has called the office again. 17 times today. I have stopped answering. He is leaving voicemails demanding to speak with you. Some of them are threatening legal action. Others are begging for a chance to explain. Do you want me to forward them to your attorney? Yes, I replied. Forward everything to David Morrison. Let him determine whether anything rises to the level of harassment that requires formal legal response. And Caroline, I am sorry you are dealing with this. Do not apologize, she texted back. This is what happens when mediocre men face consequences. They cannot believe the world is not going to protect them anymore. I find it satisfying to watch honestly. I smiled despite myself. Caroline's fierce loyalty was one of the many reasons I valued her so highly. That evening, I met Rachel for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Harvard Square. We sat at a corner table away from the crowded bar area, and Rachel immediately launched into the question she had clearly been holding back since Tuesday. Have you heard from Jonathan directly? Voicemails and texts that I am not reading or listening to, I said. My attorney is reviewing them to determine whether any constitute harassment. His mother called to tell me I am unconscionable, and they are consulting attorneys. I returned the engagement ring yesterday. I am proceeding with canceling the wedding venue and notifying guests. Rachel nodded approvingly. Swift and decisive. No room for negotiation or false reconciliation. I am proud of you. I should have done it 3 years ago, I said. The signs were always there. I just did not want to see them. Growth is not linear, Rachel said. You recognized the problem when you were ready to recognize it. You acted decisively when you had the tools and clarity to act. That is all anyone can do. Stop punishing yourself for not leaving sooner. Focus on building whatever comes next. We talked through dinner about what came next. I had a month of transition work at Blackwell Industries. Then the Atlas Corporation engagement beginning in January. My calendar was full through the following summer with existing clients and new inquiries. Professionally, I was thriving. Meridian Strategic Consulting had more work than we could handle and a reputation that continued to strengthen. Personally, I was starting over. Not rebuilding but rather discovering. Who was I when I was not managing Jonathan's insecurity? What did I actually want in a partner if I ever wanted one again? What parts of myself had I suppressed that needed to be reclaimed and honored? Take time, Rachel advised. Do not rush into another relationship trying to prove Jonathan wrong, or to fill a void. Spend time alone. Remember who you are. Do the work you love. Let everything else unfold naturally. I raised my wine glass. To unfolding naturally. Friday morning arrived with a sense of closure. The Blackwell Industries crisis had resolved. The engagement was formally ended. The ring was returned. Jonathan's contact attempts were being handled by my attorney. I had client work to focus on and a business to run. I was not happy exactly. The wounds were too fresh for happiness. But I was clear, purposeful, free from the weight of a relationship that had been slowly crushing me under the burden of constant accommodation and self-diminishment. I was myself again. Fully, completely, unapologetically myself. And that felt like the beginning of something important. The weekend following the termination brought an unexpected development that transformed what could have been a period of quiet recovery into something far more complex. Saturday morning arrived with sunshine streaming through my condominium windows and the sound of my phone ringing insistently at 7:30. I reached for it groggily, saw an unfamiliar number with a New York area code, and nearly declined the call before recognizing the exchange as belonging to a major business publication. Dr. Hayes, this is Michael Torres from Business Insight magazine. I apologize for calling so early on a weekend, but I am working on a story about corporate accountability and executive performance evaluation, and your name came up repeatedly in my research. Do you have a few minutes to speak? I sat up immediately, sleep vanishing as professional awareness took over. Business Insight magazine was one of the most respected publications in the corporate world, with a readership that included executives, board members, and institutional investors across every major industry. A story that featured my work could have significant implications for Meridian Strategic Consulting, both positive and potentially complicated. I can speak briefly, I said carefully, though I should mention that much of my work is confidential, and I cannot discuss specific client engagements without explicit permission. I understand completely, Michael said. I am actually calling because I received an anonymous tip about a situation at Blackwell Industries involving executive terminations based on performance evaluations you conducted. The tip suggested there was a personal relationship component that raised questions about objectivity and professional ethics. I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond before I publish anything. My mind raced through implications and options. Someone had leaked information to a journalist, framing the story in a way designed to damage my reputation by emphasizing the personal relationship with Jonathan, rather than the professional integrity of my work. The most likely source was either Jonathan himself, or someone in his family seeking revenge through public relations warfare. Michael, I appreciate you reaching out directly, I said. The situation you are referring to did occur, and I can provide context that I believe will give you a more complete and accurate picture. However, I need to consult with my client and my attorney before discussing specifics on the record. Can you give me until Monday morning? My deadline is Tuesday, Michael said. If I can have your response by Monday afternoon, that gives me time to incorporate it and fact-check against other sources. You will have it Monday by noon, I said. Can you tell me who else you are speaking with for this story? There was a brief pause. I have spoken with Jonathan Pierce and his attorney. I have also reached out to Blackwell Industries for comment. I am trying to get multiple perspectives before I write anything. Thank you for doing your due diligence, I said. I will provide you with a comprehensive response that includes documentation supporting my position. I believe when you see the full picture, you will recognize that this story is actually about the importance of maintaining professional standards even when circumstances are personally difficult, not about compromised objectivity. After we hung up, I immediately called Richard Blackwell despite the early weekend hour. He answered on the third ring, sounding alert despite the time. Alexandra, what can I do for you? Business Insight magazine is working on a story about the executive terminations at Blackwell Industries, I said. They received an anonymous tip emphasizing the personal relationship between Jonathan Pierce and myself, framing it as a potential ethics violation. I need your permission to provide them with information that demonstrates the integrity of the engagement and your decision-making process. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then his voice came through firm and clear. You have my full permission to discuss the engagement in whatever detail is necessary to protect your reputation and accurately represent the work you did. I will also provide a statement to the journalists supporting your professionalism and the value of your analysis. Jonathan is trying to salvage his reputation by attacking yours. We are not going to allow that. Thank you, I said. I will prepare a comprehensive response that includes documentation of the safeguards we implemented and the independent verification of my findings. This could actually become a positive story about corporate accountability if we frame it correctly. Agreed, Richard said. Let me know what you need from me. I spent the next 4 hours preparing a detailed statement for Michael Torres. The document included a timeline of my engagement at Blackwell Industries, the disclosure I made immediately upon recognizing Jonathan worked there, the decision-making process Richard and I went through regarding whether to continue the engagement, the additional oversight and verification measures we implemented, and the independent review that confirmed my findings. I included relevant excerpts from my report with Jonathan's identifying information redacted, showing the specific performance failures and policy violations that justified termination. I attached supporting documentation including the independent consultant's verification report and correspondence with Blackwell Industries' legal counsel, confirming the appropriateness of the process. The statement was 15 pages long, thoroughly documented, and demonstrated beyond question that my evaluation of Jonathan had been conducted according to rigorous professional standards with multiple layers of verification and oversight. Any journalist reviewing this material would recognize that the story was not about compromised ethics, but rather about exemplary professional conduct under challenging circumstances. I sent the statement to Richard Blackwell and to my attorney David Morrison for review. Both responded within 2 hours with minor suggestions and strong endorsements of the content. By Sunday afternoon, the statement was finalized and ready to send to Michael Torres first thing Monday morning. Sunday evening brought another unexpected call, this time from someone I had not spoken with in nearly 2 years. Dr. Patricia Vaughn, the Dean of Columbia Business School and my former dissertation advisor, called just as I was preparing dinner. Alexandra, I heard through the academic network about a situation involving your consulting practice and a personal relationship that ended badly, Patricia said without preamble. She had never been one for social pleasantries when substantive matters needed discussion. I wanted to reach out both as your former mentor and as someone who cares about your professional reputation. Are you managing this appropriately? I felt unexpected emotion rise at hearing Patricia's voice. She had been instrumental in my career development, had pushed me to pursue the doctorate when I was uncertain about investing more years in education, had connected me with early consulting clients, and had served as a reference for every major engagement I had pursued. Her opinion mattered to me both professionally and personally. I am managing it, I said. Business Insight magazine is working on a story, and I have prepared a comprehensive response with full documentation demonstrating the integrity of my work. Richard Blackwell is providing a statement supporting my professionalism. My attorney has reviewed everything. But Patricia, I appreciate you calling. It means a great deal to know you are concerned. I am always concerned when talented women face professional attacks based on personal circumstances that would be overlooked or excused if they involved men, Patricia said. Male consultants have personal relationships with people in client organizations constantly. They golf together, they attend the same social clubs, their children go to the same schools. No one questions their objectivity. But a woman has a relationship with someone who happens to work at a company she is later hired to evaluate. And suddenly it is an ethics scandal. The difference is that I was engaged to marry him, I said. That is a level of personal involvement that legitimately raises questions about objectivity, which you handled by immediately disclosing the relationship, implementing additional oversight, and having your work independently verified, Patricia countered. You did everything correctly. You went above and beyond standard professional protocols. The fact that Jonathan Pierce is now trying to use your professionalism against you by claiming conflict of interest is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior that your report apparently documented in his work performance. I sat down heavily on my couch, feeling the weight of the past week settle into my body. I should have ended the relationship years ago. I compromised myself by hiding my professional identity from him. I enabled his dismissiveness by not correcting his assumptions about my work. If I had been honest from the beginning, none of this would have happened. If you had been honest from the beginning, he might have stayed in the relationship while systematically undermining your professional reputation to manage his own insecurity, Patricia said. Or he might have ended things himself and you would have spent the past 3 years building an even stronger practice without the distraction of managing his ego. You cannot know what would have happened. What you can know is that you conducted yourself with integrity when it mattered most. You did not compromise your professional standards to protect a personal relationship. That is exactly what ethical behavior looks like, even when it is difficult and costly. We talked for another 30 minutes about the situation, about my decision-making process, and about the broader implications for women in consulting who face constant scrutiny of their professional judgment in ways that male colleagues rarely experienced. Patricia offered to provide a statement to Business Insight magazine if needed, emphasizing my academic credentials and professional reputation. I thanked her and said I would reach out if the story developed in ways that required additional support. After we hung up, I felt steadier. The conversation had reminded me that my professional network extended far beyond this one complicated situation. I had spent 14 years building relationships with people who knew the quality of my work and the integrity of my methods. Jonathan Pierce could attempt to damage my reputation, but he was fighting against a foundation of credibility that would withstand his attacks. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after difficult decisions have been made and difficult conversations have been completed. I sent my comprehensive statement to Michael Torres at 9 o'clock with a cover email offering to answer any additional questions and providing contact information for Richard Blackwell and Patricia Vaughn as references who could speak to my professional reputation and methods. Michael responded within an hour. Dr. Hayes, thank you for this detailed response. This is significantly more documentation than I typically receive, and it paints a very different picture than the one Jonathan Pierce presented. I am going to restructure the story to focus on corporate accountability and the challenges of maintaining professional objectivity in complex situations. I will send you the relevant excerpts for fact-checking before publication. I felt tension I had not fully acknowledged drain from my shoulders. The story was shifting from an attack piece questioning my ethics to a more nuanced exploration of professional standards and corporate governance. That shift would make an enormous difference in how the situation was perceived by potential clients and by the broader business community. Caroline called at 10:30 with news that 3 additional client inquiries had come in over the weekend, all from organizations that had heard about the Blackwell Industries situation through informal networks and wanted the same level of rigorous evaluation. Word was spreading that I was willing to make difficult recommendations regardless of personal or political complications, and that reputation was apparently valuable to organizations struggling with leadership dysfunction. Also, Caroline added, Jonathan Pierce's attorney sent a formal letter demanding that you cease making defamatory statements about his client and threatening legal action if you continue to damage Mr. Pierce's professional reputation. Forward it to David Morrison, I said. Jonathan's attorney is posturing. Everything I have said about his performance is documented and defensible. They are trying to intimidate me into silence, and it will not work. I spent Monday afternoon at Blackwell Industries conducting transition meetings with the executives who were taking over responsibilities from the terminated and resigned leaders. These meetings were critical for ensuring continuity and for setting clear expectations about performance standards and accountability measures going forward. The executives I met with were universally relieved that the organization was taking performance seriously and were eager to demonstrate that they could meet higher standards than their predecessors had. One conversation particularly stood out. Jennifer Michaels, a 42-year-old operations manager who was being promoted to replace Jonathan as Director of Strategic Operations, sat across from me in a conference room reviewing the transition plan with careful attention. "I want to say something that might be inappropriate," Jennifer said after we had covered the operational details. "But I think it needs to be said anyway." "Go ahead," I encouraged. "I worked under Jonathan Pierce for 18 months, Jennifer said. "He was the worst manager I have ever experienced. He took credit for our work, blamed us for his failures, and created an environment where people were afraid to speak up or take initiative because they never knew when he would throw them under the bus. 3 of my colleagues quit specifically because of him. I applied for the director position when it opened before Jonathan got promoted, and I was told I needed more experience. Meanwhile, Jonathan got the job because his uncle advocated for him, even though everyone who actually worked with him knew he was incompetent." She paused, then continued with quiet intensity. "What you did took courage. You evaluated him honestly even though you were engaged to him. You documented his failures even though it would cost you personally. Because of your work, this department has a chance to recover, and the people who have been suffering under his management finally feel heard and valued. So thank you. From all of us who had to work under him, thank you for having the integrity to tell the truth even when it was hard." I felt unexpected emotion tighten my throat. "Thank you for saying that. It has been a difficult week personally, and hearing that the work mattered to the people affected makes it worthwhile." "It mattered enormously," Jennifer said. "You changed lives. Mine included." That evening I met Rachel for dinner again at her suggestion. She took one look at my face and ordered wine immediately. "Tell me about your day," she said. I recounted the conversation with Michael Torres, the preparation of the comprehensive statement, the call from Patricia Vaughn, and the meeting with Jennifer Michaels. Rachel listened with the focused attention of someone trained to analyze organizational dynamics and human behavior. "You are experiencing what happens when women refuse to make themselves small," Rachel said when I finished. "Jonathan and his family expected you to quietly disappear or to minimize his failures to protect him. Instead, you documented the truth and stood behind your professional judgment. That refusal to accommodate male mediocrity is threatening to everyone who benefits from the system that protects incompetent men. So they are attacking you for being unethical, for being vindictive, for violating relationship boundaries. Anything to avoid acknowledging the actual issue, which is that Jonathan was genuinely bad at his job and your evaluation was accurate." The Business Insight magazine story could have destroyed my reputation if Michael Torres had not been willing to look at the documentation, I said. "If he had simply taken Jonathan's version and run with it, I would be defending myself against ethics violations for months." "Which is exactly why you spent your weekend preparing 15 pages of documentation," Rachel said. "You know how to defend yourself. You know how to build an airtight case. And you know how to leverage your professional network to provide context and credibility. Those skills are exactly why you are successful and why attacks like Jonathan's ultimately fail. You are always 3 steps ahead." Tuesday morning brought the published Business Insight magazine article. The headline read, "Corporate Accountability in the Age of Executive Dysfunction: When Personal Relationships Intersect with Professional Evaluation." The article was 4,000 words long and presented a balanced, thoughtful exploration of the challenges organizations faced in evaluating executive performance and the importance of rigorous methodology, even when circumstances were personally complicated. Michael Torres had interviewed Richard Blackwell extensively, and Richard's quotes emphasized the integrity of my process and the value of my analysis. Dr. Hayes disclosed the personal relationship immediately and suggested recusing herself. I made the decision to continue the engagement because her professional reputation was impeccable, and because I believed with appropriate safeguards, her evaluation would be objective. An independent consultant verified her findings. The decision to terminate Jonathan Pierce was based on extensive documented evidence of performance failures. Dr. Hayes provided exactly the kind of rigorous, honest assessment we hired her to deliver. Patricia Vaughn was quoted discussing the broader context of women in consulting and the double standards they faced. Female consultants are held to impossibly high standards, while male consultants navigate similar situations without scrutiny. Dr. Hayes handled this situation with exemplary professionalism. She implemented safeguards that went beyond standard practice. The fact that her work is being questioned says more about gender bias in professional services than about her actual conduct. The article included brief quotes from Jonathan describing himself as a victim of a vindictive evaluation driven by personal animus. But those quotes were immediately followed by excerpts from my documentation showing his performance failures, the independent verification of my findings, and the legal counsel confirmation that the termination was justified. Jonathan's narrative was presented but thoroughly undermined by the evidence. The final paragraphs of the article focused on the broader implications for corporate governance and the importance of organizations being willing to make difficult personnel decisions based on objective performance data, rather than relationships or politics. I was quoted in the closing. Organizations fail when they protect underperforming leaders because of personal relationships or political considerations. My job is to provide objective assessment of leadership effectiveness so companies can make informed decisions. That responsibility does not change based on my personal circumstances. If anything, challenging situations require even more rigorous methodology and even higher standards of documentation and verification. I read the article 3 times, feeling relief wash over me in waves. This was not a hit piece questioning my ethics. This was a thoughtful exploration of professional standards that positioned me as someone who maintained integrity under difficult circumstances. The article would enhance rather than damage my reputation. Caroline called within an hour of publication. Alexandra, my phone has not stopped ringing. 6 new client inquiries this morning. 2 from Fortune 500 companies. One specifically mentioned the Business Insight article and said they want a consultant willing to deliver hard truths regardless of politics. Your calendar is going to be completely full for the next 2 years. I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph exactly, but rather validation. The decision to end my relationship with Jonathan, to stand behind my professional evaluation despite the personal cost, to refuse to compromise my integrity to protect someone who had publicly humiliated me, that decision was being vindicated in the most tangible way possible. My business was thriving. My reputation was strengthening. And I was free from a relationship that had been slowly suffocating my authentic self. Wednesday brought the final piece of closure I needed. David Morrison called to inform me that Jonathan's attorney had withdrawn their threat of legal action after reading the Business Insight magazine article and reviewing the documentation I had provided. Jonathan had no basis for a lawsuit, and pursuing one would only further damage his already battered reputation. They are going to go quiet, David said. Jonathan will look for a job in a different city, probably claiming he wants a fresh start. His family will work their connections to find him something at a level appropriate to his actual competence rather than his inflated self-image. You will not hear from him again because engaging with you further only reminds everyone of his failures. Good, I said simply. That evening I sat on my balcony watching the sunset over the Charles River, and allowed myself to fully feel the weight of what had happened over the past 2 weeks. I had ended my engagement. I had terminated my former fiancé's employment based on objective evaluation of his incompetence. I had faced threatened legal action and potential professional damage. I had defended my reputation with comprehensive documentation and support from my professional network. And I had emerged not just intact but stronger. The relationship with Jonathan had required me to be smaller, quieter, less accomplished, less visible. It had demanded that I hide essential parts of myself to make him comfortable. It had slowly eroded my sense of self because I was constantly calculating how to manage his insecurity rather than simply being who I was. That version of my life was over. Permanently. I was Dr. Alexandra Hayes. I held a doctorate from Columbia and an MBA from Wharton. I ran a successful consulting firm that advised major corporations on leadership and organizational effectiveness. I was respected in my field. I was good at my work. I was accomplished and capable and valuable exactly as I was, without diminishment or apology. Any relationship I entered in the future would need to accommodate that reality rather than requiring me to hide it. Any partner I chose would need to celebrate my success rather than feel threatened by it. And if that meant remaining single for years or forever, that was infinitely preferable to the slow suffocation of hiding myself to protect someone else's ego. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Wine Thursday night to celebrate surviving and thriving? I have news too. Might have a book deal. I smiled and typed back immediately. Absolutely. My place. 7 o'clock. Congratulations on the book deal. Cannot wait to hear details. Thursday evening arrived with Rachel bearing wine and Thai food in what was becoming our post-crisis ritual. She sprawled on my couch with the comfort of someone who had been my closest friend for over a decade and raised her glass in a toast. To women who refused to shrink, she said. And to the spectacular collapse of mediocre men who thought they could control us. We drank to that. Then Rachel told me about her book deal. A contract with a major academic press to write about gender dynamics in organizational leadership based on her research. We talked about collaborating on some of the case studies, with my consulting experiences providing real-world examples to complement her theoretical framework. I want to include your story, Rachel said, obviously with details changed and anonymized. But the dynamic of a highly accomplished woman hiding her success to accommodate a less accomplished male partner, then being professionally attacked when she stops accommodating, that is a pattern that needs to be documented and analyzed. Use whatever you need, I said. If my experience can help other women recognize these patterns earlier and exit faster, that would make it worthwhile. We talked late into the evening about ambition and relationships, about the unique challenges women faced in balancing professional success with personal connections, about the cultural conditioning that taught women to make themselves smaller to avoid threatening male egos. We talked about the future we wanted to build, both individually and collectively through our work. When Rachel left at midnight, I felt genuinely hopeful for the first time since Friday night's promotion dinner. The past 2 weeks had been difficult and painful and transformative, but I had not just survived them. I had emerged clearer about who I was and what I would accept in my life going forward. Friday morning brought a final unexpected development. Richard Blackwell called to inform me that the board of directors at Blackwell Industries had been so impressed with my work and the Business Insight magazine article that they wanted to retain Meridian Strategic Consulting on an ongoing basis as their corporate governance advisors. The engagement would involve quarterly reviews of executive performance, annual comprehensive evaluations, and consultation on succession planning and organizational development. This is a substantial long-term contract, Richard said. 6 figures annually for at least 3 years. The board believes your work saved this company from continuing to promote and protect underperforming leaders. They want to institutionalize that level of accountability going forward. I felt professional satisfaction settle deep in my chest. This was validation at the highest level. Not just a successful engagement, but a transformation of that engagement into an ongoing strategic partnership that would provide both financial stability and continuing impact. I am honored by their confidence, I said. Send the contract details to Caroline and I will review with my attorney. I look forward to continuing to work with Blackwell Industries. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my office looking out at the Boston skyline. 2 weeks ago I had been engaged to a man who dismissed my professional competence publicly. I had been hiding essential parts of myself to maintain a relationship that required my diminishment. I had been accommodating and compromising and slowly disappearing into a smaller version of myself. Now I was free. My business was thriving. My reputation was strengthened rather than damaged by the most personally difficult professional situation I had ever faced. I had support from mentors, friends, and colleagues who valued my integrity and competence. I had reclaimed my authentic self and refused to apologize for my success or my standards. The transformation had been painful. The cost had been real. But the outcome was exactly what I needed, even if I had not fully recognized how desperately I needed it until the relationship ended. I opened my calendar and looked at the months ahead. Client engagements, speaking opportunities, the ongoing partnership with Blackwell Industries, collaboration with Rachel on her book, time with friends, Space to rediscover myself without constantly managing someone else's insecurity. It looked like freedom. It looked like possibility. It looked like a life built on my own terms, rather than shaped to accommodate someone else's limitations. I smiled and got back to work. The weeks following the Business Insight magazine article brought a transformation that extended far beyond professional validation. November arrived with crisp New England weather and a sense of possibility that felt entirely new. I had spent 3 years molding myself to fit Jonathan's expectations, and now I faced the unfamiliar challenge of remembering who I actually was when I was not performing a carefully curated version of myself, designed to make someone else comfortable. The process of rediscovery began in unexpected ways. The first Saturday of November, I woke without an alarm for the first time in months and realized I had no obligations scheduled. No brunch with Jonathan's family. No company events where I needed to play the supportive fiancé role. No carefully managed social calendar designed to advance his career, while keeping mine appropriately invisible. Just an entire day that belonged entirely to me with no expectations or performances required. I made coffee and sat on my balcony despite the cold, wrapped in a blanket, watching the morning light spread across the Charles River. The silence felt luxurious rather than lonely. I opened my laptop not to work but to browse through old files I had not accessed in years. Personal writing from before I met Jonathan. Journal entries about professional goals and dreams. Notes about research interests I had meant to pursue, but had somehow never found time for while managing the emotional labor of my relationship. Reading those files felt like encountering a version of myself I had forgotten existed. The woman who wrote those words had been ambitious without apology. She had been excited about her work without feeling the need to downplay her accomplishments. She had been planning projects and collaborations and expansions without constantly calculating whether her success would threaten someone else's ego. That woman had not yet learned to make herself smaller, and I wanted her back. I spent that Saturday morning making lists. Not the practical professional lists that filled my work life, but personal inventories of things I had stopped doing during my relationship with Jonathan. Activities I had enjoyed before meeting him that I had gradually abandoned because they took time away from managing his needs, or because he had subtly discouraged them with comments about how I was always busy or never available or too focused on my own interests. The list was longer than I expected. I had stopped attending the monthly Women's Leadership Roundtable hosted by my friend Dr. Sarah Mitchell, because the meetings conflicted with Jonathan's preferred schedule for our date nights. I had declined speaking invitations at academic conferences because Jonathan complained that I traveled too much for work already. I had stopped taking weekend painting classes that I had loved because Jonathan thought painting was a hobby for people with too much free time. I had gradually reduced contact with friends Jonathan found intimidating or too accomplished, which was most of my professional network. I had stopped reading for pleasure because the evenings when I might have read were instead spent listening to Jonathan talk about his day and his work and his frustrations. Each item on the list represented a small compromise. Individually they had seemed reasonable, even considerate. But collectively they represented a systematic dismantling of my independent identity in service of a relationship that demanded my constant accommodation without offering reciprocal flexibility. I called Sarah Mitchell that afternoon. She answered on the second ring with the warm enthusiasm I remembered from before I had gradually faded from her life. "Alexandra, I have been thinking about you constantly since I saw that Business Insight article. How are you doing? Really doing, not the professional version." "I am rebuilding," I said honestly. "The engagement is over. The relationship is over. I am trying to remember who I was before I spent 3 years making myself smaller. And I realized I have not attended your Women's Leadership Roundtable in almost 2 years. I would like to come back if you will have me." "Alexandra, you are always welcome," Sarah said. Her voice carried emotion that made my throat tighten. "I have missed you. Several of us have talked about how you seemed to disappear gradually after you got engaged. We worried but did not know how to reach out without seeming judgmental. I am so glad you are coming back to yourself." We talked for over an hour. Sarah told me about the roundtable's evolution, the new members who had joined, the topics they had been exploring. She invited me to present at the next meeting about maintaining professional integrity in complex situations, using my recent experience as a case study. I agreed immediately, recognizing that sharing my story in a supportive environment might help other women recognize similar patterns in their own lives and relationships. That conversation opened a floodgate. Over the following week, I reconnected with friends and colleagues I had gradually distanced myself from during my relationship with Jonathan. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Initial awkwardness about the separation, then relief that I was free, then genuine warmth as we reconnected and began rebuilding relationships that had been neglected or damaged by my 3-year disappearing act. Dr. Marcus Chan, a colleague from my doctoral program who now taught organizational behavior at Stanford, video called me on a Tuesday evening. We had been close friends during graduate school and had maintained regular contact until approximately 2 years ago, when our communication had gradually dwindled to occasional emails. "I read the Business Insight article," Marcus said without preamble, "and my first reaction was relief that you are finally free of that relationship. My second reaction was anger at myself for not reaching out more forcefully when you started pulling away from our friendship. I suspected something was wrong but convinced myself you were just busy." "I was busy managing Jonathan's insecurity," I said. He never explicitly told me not to maintain friendships with male colleagues, but he made enough pointed comments about how much time I spent talking to you and others that I gradually stopped initiating contact to avoid the conflict. That was my choice and my responsibility. You have nothing to feel guilty about. I want to collaborate on the research project we talked about years ago," Marcus said. "The one about gender dynamics in corporate consulting, and the ways female consultants navigate client expectations differently than their male counterparts. I think your recent experience gives us compelling data and a framework for understanding how personal relationships intersect with professional identity for women in ways they do not for men." We spent 2 hours that evening sketching out a research design that excited me more than any project had in years. The collaboration would combine Marcus's academic expertise in organizational behavior with my practitioner experience in corporate consulting. We would interview female consultants across multiple firms, analyze patterns in how they managed professional identity and personal relationships, and develop frameworks for understanding the unique pressures women faced in maintaining authenticity while navigating gendered expectations. The project represented something I had lost during my relationship with Jonathan: intellectual engagement with peers who respected my expertise, creative collaboration that expanded my thinking rather than requiring me to constrain it, the freedom to pursue interests because they fascinated me rather than calculating whether they would create conflict or take time away from relationship maintenance. As I worked on the research design with Marcus over the following weeks, I recognized how much I had missed this aspect of my professional life. Jonathan had tolerated my client work because it generated income, and because he fundamentally did not understand what I actually did well enough to feel threatened by it. But he had been actively uncomfortable with my academic connections and research interests, dismissing them as impractical or overly intellectual. His discomfort had led me to gradually de-emphasize that part of my professional identity, focusing exclusively on client engagements and business development, while abandoning the research and thought leadership that had originally drawn me to organizational psychology. I was reclaiming that part of myself now, not just professionally but as an essential component of who I was and what brought me genuine satisfaction. The second Saturday of November brought another step in the reconstruction process. I drove to a small art studio in Jamaica Plain that offered open painting sessions for adults. I had not painted in nearly 3 years, not since Jonathan had made one too many dismissive comments about hobbies for people with nothing better to do with their time. The studio was warm and filled with natural light, with a dozen easels set up and an instructor available to provide guidance if requested. I spent 4 hours that afternoon painting without any particular goal or expectation, just mixing colors and applying them to canvas in ways that felt intuitive rather than planned. The work was mediocre by any objective standard, but the process was deeply satisfying. I was not producing anything useful or profitable or impressive. I was simply engaged in an activity that brought me pleasure for no reason beyond the pleasure itself. The woman working at the easel next to mine introduced herself as Maria, a social worker in her mid-50s who had recently returned to painting after a divorce. We painted in companionable silence for a while before she spoke. "It takes time to remember who you were before you spent years accommodating someone else's needs," Maria said quietly, not looking up from her canvas. "But it is worth the effort. You will find parts of yourself you forgot existed." And you will discover new parts you never had the space to develop while you were busy managing someone else's feelings. I looked over at her. This stranger who somehow understood exactly what I was experiencing. How long does it take? Different for everyone, Maria said. For me, it was about a year before I stopped automatically calculating how my ex-husband would react to my choices. Another 6 months before I stopped feeling guilty for prioritizing my own needs. But Alexandra, the freedom is worth every difficult moment of the transition. I was startled that she knew my name until I remembered that the Business Insight article had been widely circulated. My situation was apparently more publicly known than I had fully processed. I read about what you did, Maria continued. Evaluating your fiancé honestly and standing behind your professional judgment, even though it cost you the relationship. That took extraordinary courage. You are going to inspire a lot of women who are currently making themselves smaller to keep someone else comfortable. We painted together for another hour, occasionally exchanging observations about color or technique, but mostly working in silence. When I left that afternoon, I had completed a painting that I would never show anyone because it had no artistic merit whatsoever. But I also had a sense of connection to something essential in myself that had been missing for 3 years. The part that engaged in activities for pure enjoyment rather than strategic benefit. The part that valued process over outcome. The part that was allowed to be mediocre at something without that mediocrity reflecting on my worth or competence. That evening I hung the terrible painting in my home office where I would see it daily. A reminder that not everything I did needed to be excellent or productive or impressive. Sometimes it was enough to simply do something that brought me pleasure without justification or apology. The professional sphere continued to thrive in ways that validated my decision to end the relationship and stand behind my evaluation of Jonathan. The Atlas Corporation engagement began in mid-November with a kickoff meeting that demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership dysfunction I had been hired to address. Margaret Chun, the CEO, had built an impressive company through force of personality and strategic vision. But her executive team was increasingly fragmented by conflicts and competing agendas that were undermining operational effectiveness. My initial assessment revealed patterns similar to what I had observed at Blackwell Industries, though less severe. 2 executives were actively undermining each other through subtle sabotage and selective information sharing. One executive was checked out emotionally and professionally, coasting on past accomplishments while contributing minimal current value. Another was overwhelmed and drowning but unwilling to admit it or ask for help. The remaining 2 were competent and frustrated, considering leaving because they were tired of compensating for their colleagues' dysfunction. Margaret had suspected most of this but lacked concrete evidence and clear framework for addressing it. My role was to provide both. Over the following weeks, I conducted extensive interviews with employees at every level of the organization, analyzed operational and financial data, observed leadership meetings and decision-making processes, and documented patterns of behavior that confirmed and expanded on Margaret's instincts. The work was absorbing in the way that excellent consulting work always was. Each interview revealed new layers of organizational dynamics. Each data point added to a picture that was gradually coming into focus. Each observation provided insight into how leadership behavior created ripple effects throughout the organization. I was completely engaged professionally in a way I had not been during the final year of my relationship with Jonathan, when I had been constantly distracted by the emotional labor of managing his insecurity and the cognitive dissonance of maintaining a relationship that increasingly felt inauthentic. One evening in late November, I was working late at Atlas Corporation's offices analyzing financial data when Margaret stopped by my temporary workspace. She had a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "It is after 7, she said. "Everyone else has gone home. I thought we could talk informally if you have time." We sat in her office overlooking downtown San Francisco's skyline, and Margaret poured wine with the casual confidence of someone who had built a company from nothing and was not intimidated by much. "I read the Business Insight article about your situation at Blackwell Industries," Margaret said. "I want you to know that reading about how you handled that situation was part of why I hired you. I need someone who will tell me difficult truths, even when they are personally uncomfortable. Someone who will not soften their assessment to avoid conflict or protect relationships. What you did with your fiancé, evaluating him honestly and standing behind that evaluation even though it destroyed your relationship, that demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity I need." Thank you, I said. Though I will note that the relationship was already failing. The evaluation just made that failure impossible to ignore. Margaret smiled. That is usually how it works. The crisis does not create the problem. It reveals the problem that was always there but that we were working very hard not to see. I suspect you have some findings about my executive team that I am not going to enjoy hearing. I have findings that will require difficult decisions, I said carefully. But they are decisions you already know you need to make. I am simply providing the documentation and framework to act on what you already suspect. We talked for over an hour about leadership, about building organizations, about the challenges of making personnel decisions when relationships and politics complicated objective assessment. Margaret shared her own experiences of having to terminate executives she personally liked, but who were not performing adequately. I shared insights from my years of consulting about how successful organizations separated personal affinity from professional accountability. The hardest lesson I have learned, Margaret said as we finished the wine, is that being kind to individuals who are not meeting standards is actually being cruel to everyone else in the organization who is performing well. When you tolerate mediocrity or dysfunction to avoid uncomfortable conversations, you are telling your high performers that excellence does not matter. You are creating an environment where the people who should leave stay and the people who should stay leave. That is exactly what was happening at Blackwell Industries, I said. Jonathan Pierce was costing the company millions in lost productivity and talent attrition. But he was protected because of family connections and because addressing his failure would have been uncomfortable. Every month he stayed was another month of damage to people who deserved better leadership. And your report gave Richard Blackwell the framework to act decisively, Margaret said. That is what I am hiring you to give me. The clarity and documentation to do what I already know needs to be done. I left that conversation feeling the deep professional satisfaction that came from knowing my work had meaningful impact. This was why I had built Meridian Strategic Consulting. Not to destroy careers or end relationships, but to help organizations function more effectively by ensuring leadership was held to high standards of performance and accountability. The personal cost of the Blackwell engagement had been significant, but the professional outcome had been exactly what good consulting should produce. Thanksgiving week arrived with an invitation I had not anticipated. My younger sister Amanda, who I had not spoken with in over a year due to scheduling conflicts and the gradual distancing that sometimes occurs in adult sibling relationships, called on Monday evening. Alexandra, I know we have not been close lately, Amanda said. But Mom told me about your broken engagement and what happened with Jonathan. I wanted to reach out and say that I am proud of you. What you did took courage, and I am sorry you had to go through it. We talked for over an hour, catching up on each other's lives and rebuilding connection that had frayed during my relationship with Jonathan. Amanda had noticed my gradual withdrawal from family events and had correctly attributed it to Jonathan's influence, though she had not known how to address it without seeming intrusive. He always seemed uncomfortable when you talked about your work, Amanda observed. Like he was threatened by your success. I mentioned it to Mom once and she said I was being too sensitive. But I noticed. And I worried. Amanda invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her family in Portland, Maine. She had a husband and 2 young children I barely knew because Jonathan had consistently found reasons why we could not attend family gatherings. Work obligations that could not be postponed. Prior commitments that he insisted took priority. Subtle pressure that made declining easier than arguing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.